The VIP lounge of Club Onyx smelled of expensive cigars and cold cruelty. Kang-Dae, a man whose childhood was forged in the blood of his father's enemies, thrived on the scent. To him, humans were either predators or prey. He looked at Zora, the black waitress standing before him, and saw nothing but a target for his boredom. "The floor is dirty, waitress," Kang-Dae drawled, his eyes glassy from high-grade narcotics. He tossed a handful of high-denomination bills into a puddle of spilled liquor. "Clean it with your tongue, and I'll pay for your sister's hospital stay. Refuse, and you'll leave here in a body bag." The club grew silent. Kang-Dae's men chuckled, their hands on their holsters. They didn't see the way Zora's feet shifted into a perfect cat stance under her long skirt. They didn't know that 3 years ago, she was the Black Lotus, the youngest undefeated kung fu champion in the underground circuit, a woman who had retired because she was tired of the blood on her hands. "I gave up violence to find peace," Zora said, her voice like cracking ice. "But for you, I'll make an exception." She pounced on him, giving him 2 blows to his face. His men tried to attack her, and she beat up all of them to a pulp.
Before we continue, we welcome you to Afro-Korean love thrillers, the home of dark romance, forbidden passion, power, betrayal, and captivating revenge stories. Please do me a favor. Tap that comment section and tell us quickly where you are watching from. Stay tuned. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any new thriller that drops here. Sit back and relax because this story is just getting started. Now let's get back to our story.
The air in the private penthouse suite of the Kang-Dae estate was thick with the scent of unlit tobacco and the electric hum of a city that never slept. Kang-Dae stood before a massive window, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of Seoul's neon arteries. He didn't see the beauty of the skyline. He saw a grid he intended to suffocate. He adjusted his cufflink, the gold cool against his skin, but his mind was 30 years in the past, locked in a cold basement in Busan. "Do it, Kang-Dae," his father's voice echoed in his memory, a jagged blade of a sound. "A king does not look away from the rot, he cuts it out." At 10 years old, Kang-Dae had been forced to hold a pistol that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Before him had knelt a man he once called Uncle, a man who had brought him sweets but had eventually siphoned funds from the syndicate. His father's hand had been a heavy iron weight on his shoulder, squeezing until the bone bruised. That was the day the boy died, and the monster was born. The blast had been deafening, but the silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of a soul, surrendering to the dark. Now, decades later, Kang-Dae turned away from the window, his eyes as hollow as the life he led. He picked up a small vial from his desk, the white powder inside shimmering under the recessed lighting. This was his true mistress, the only thing that quieted the screaming ghosts of his childhood. He took a hit, feeling the familiar, jagged rush of artificial power. It made him feel like a god, and gods didn't care about the collateral damage of their whims. "Sir," his assistant, a man named Minho, whispered from the shadows of the doorway. "The preparations at Club Onyx are complete. The target for tonight's entertainment has been selected." Kang-Dae let out a slow, predatory exhale. He felt a craving for more than just the drug. He wanted to see someone break. He wanted to watch the light go out of another human's eyes so he didn't have to feel so alone in his own darkness. He grabbed his coat, the silk lining whispering against his shirt. He was heading to the club to play a game he always won, unaware that tonight he wouldn't be meeting a victim. He would be meeting his match. The morning mist in the mountains of Gyeonggi-do was thick and tasted of damp pine. 3 years ago, Zora Vance had stood at the edge of a cliff in this very range, clutching a heavy gold trophy that felt like lead in her hands. She was the Black Lotus, the undisputed champion of the underground wushu circuits, a woman whose speed was whispered about in the gambling dens of Macau and Hong Kong. But as she looked at her bruised knuckles, all she could see was the face of the young fighter she had nearly crippled in the final round, a boy who had fought for his family's debt, just like she did. In that moment of victory, the applause had sounded like static. Zora didn't want the gold, she wanted the silence. She had walked to the edge and let the trophy fall into the abyss, watching it vanish into the clouds. "Violence is a hungry ghost, Zora," her Sifu had told her, his voice weary. The more you feed it, the larger it grows until there is no room left for you. Now, the only ghosts Zora dealt with were the patrons of Club Onyx. Her life was a meticulously constructed cage of routine. She woke up in a room the size of a closet, counted her one for her sister's dialysis, and donned the stiff, black-and-white uniform of a waitress. Her once lethal hands were now calloused from carrying heavy trays of crystal glassware instead of breaking bricks. She moved through the crowded, neon-soaked floor of the club like a phantom, her eyes downcast, her posture slumped to hide the powerful muscles of a world-class athlete. "Table 4 needs more ice, Vance. Move it!" The floor manager barked, his voice cutting through the thumping bass of the music. Zora nodded, a practiced, submissive gesture. She felt the itch in her palms, the muscle memory of a double palm strike that could collapse a man's ribcage, but she pushed it down. She had promised herself she would never hurt another soul. She was saving a life now, not ending one. She picked up a bucket of ice, her gaze catching a glimpse of her reflection in the polished obsidian walls. The woman staring back looked tired, her mahogany skin dull under the harsh fluorescent lights of the service bar. She didn't see the black Maybachs pulling up to the curb outside. She didn't see the men in charcoal suits clearing the VIP path. Zora simply tightened her apron, unaware that the hungry ghost she had tried to starve in the mountains was about to be served a feast. The Black Lotus was still there, buried under layers of humility and desperation, waiting for a reason to bloom one last time. The air in the VIP lounge of Club Onyx changed the moment Kang-Dae entered. It wasn't just the smell of his expensive sandalwood cologne. It was the sharp, jagged edge of a man who looked at the world as his personal playground. He sat in the center of a velvet semicircle, his movements twitchy and restless, a side effect of the chemicals currently screaming through his veins. To his left and right sat his hounds, 4 massive men in tailored suits whose only job was to amplify their master's cruelty. Zora approached the table, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had seen men like this before, predators who mistook wealth for divinity. She set the tray down with a practiced click, her hands steady despite the oppressive atmosphere. "Your champagne, sir," she said, her voice a low, neutral hum. Kang-Dae didn't look at the bottle. He looked at Zora. He noted the way she didn't flinch when his men laughed loudly. He noted the deep mahogany of her skin and the quiet dignity she carried like a shield. It rankled him. He hated anything he couldn't immediately frighten. "I didn't ask for champagne," Kang-Dae lied, his voice a dangerous drawl. He reached out and tipped the bottle over, watching the $5,000 liquid soak into the white carpet. "I asked for a show, and I think I've found my lead actress." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of bills, tossing them into the expanding puddle of alcohol. "The floor is messy, waitress. It's a health hazard. Clean it up. Use your tongue, and I'll double the tip. My friends here want to see if the rumors about foreign hospitality are true." The socialites in the surrounding booths leaned in, their phones held high like digital daggers. Zora felt the first spark of heat in her chest, the lotus beginning to unfurl. She looked at the money, then at the man whose face was twisted into a mask of drug-fueled malice. "I am a waitress, not a dog," Zora said, her Korean sharpening, the submissive tone vanishing entirely. The laughter died instantly. Kang-Dae leaned forward, his eyes dilating. "What did you say?" "I said," Zora repeated, finally looking him dead in the eye. Her posture shifting as her center of gravity lowered, "that you should pick up your trash before I make you eat it." Kang-Dae's face went purple with rage. He signaled his men with a flick of his wrist. "Teach her. Break her legs so she has to crawl." As the first guard lunged, the bass of the club's music seemed to sync with Zora's heartbeat. She didn't see a bodyguard, she saw an opening. The simple life she had fought for was over. The Black Lotus was back. The first guard moved like a sledgehammer, heavy, predictable, and slow. To Zora, who had trained her eyes to track the flight of a hummingbird, he was practically standing still. As his massive fist whistled toward her temple, she didn't retreat. She stepped into his space, a move known in her circles as the hidden moon. With a flick of her wrist, she caught his forearm and redirected his momentum, sending his 300-pound frame headfirst into the obsidian bar. The sound of his skull meeting the stone, was a dull thud that silenced the room. "One," Zora whispered. The other 3 guards didn't wait. They attacked in a coordinated triangle, a standard tactical formation meant to overwhelm. But Zora wasn't a standard opponent. She was a master of chin-na, the art of seizing and locking. She dropped into a low sweep, her leg a scythe of mahogany muscle that took the feet out from under the second man. As he fell, she rose like a shadow, her elbow connecting with the third man's solar plexus with the force of a hydraulic press. The air left his lungs in a wheeze as he collapsed, clutching a chest that felt like it had been hit by a freight train. The 4th guard, the largest of the group, pulled a collapsible baton. He swung with lethal intent, but Zora caught the weapon midair. With a sickening crack, she snapped his wrist using a simple lever principle. She didn't stop there. She transitioned into a spinning back kick that sent him flying over a velvet sofa and into a wall of expensive crystal. The hounds were down. Total elapsed time, 9 seconds. On the 10th second, Zora turned her gaze to Kang-Dae. The Mafia boss was no longer laughing. The vial of white powder had fallen from his hand, spilling across the floor he had just ordered her to lick. He tried to stand, his knees shaking as the drug-induced bravado evaporated, replaced by the primal terror of a man who had finally met a real predator. Zora walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the alcohol-soaked carpet. She picked up a jagged shard of a broken champagne bottle. In one fluid motion, she pressed the glass against the pulse point of his neck. The Black Lotus looked into the soul of the monster and saw nothing but a frightened little boy. "You wanted a show, Kang-Dae," Zora hissed, her voice a low, lethal vibration. "This is the final act. If I ever see your face in this part of the city again, I won't use my hands. I'll use the monster you think you are." She pulled the glass back, leaving a thin, red line on his throat, a permanent reminder of how close he had come to the abyss. As the sirens of the Seoul Metropolitan Police began to wail in the distance, Zora vanished into the emergency exit, leaving the Dragon of Seoul broken in the middle of his own playground. The silence in the VIP lounge didn't last long. As the adrenaline faded, the blue glow of 100 smartphones filled the room. Within minutes, the footage of the Waitress from Hell was uploaded to every major social media platform in Korea. It wasn't just a fight, it was a phenomenon. The video, grainy and flickering under the strobe lights, captured the impossible. A lone woman systematically dismantling the city's most feared enforcers with the cold precision of a machine. By the time Zora reached her cramped apartment, her face was trending under the hashtag Black Lotus Soul. "Zora, what have you done?" her sister, Maya, whispered, looking up from a laptop screen in their dimly lit living room. Maya's face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes a constant reminder of the failing kidneys that kept them tethered to this expensive city. Zora didn't answer immediately. She went straight to the sink and scrubbed her knuckles until the skin was raw. The hungry ghost was howling now, fed by the familiar rush of combat. "I did what I had to do, Maya. We have to go, now." While Zora packed their meager belongings into 2 duffel bags, the city was reacting. In the high-rise boardrooms of the Black Dragon Syndicate, the video was being played on a loop. The elders of the Mafia were not embarrassed by the violence, they were embarrassed by the weakness. Kang-Dae had been bested by a girl, a foreigner, a nobody. To them, that was a death sentence for the family's reputation. But for Kang-Dae, sitting in a dark corner of his penthouse with a bandage on his neck, the video was a revelation. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a mirror. He watched the way she moved, the economy of motion, the absolute lack of wasted energy. He realized that his entire life had been a series of loud, messy tantrums, while this woman possessed a quiet, terrifying power that he had never even dreamed of. "Find her," Kang-Dae commanded Minho, his voice cracking. He didn't sound like a boss, he sounded like a man possessed. "Do not let the elders get to her first. I don't want her dead. I want to know. I want to know how she can be that strong and still be so calm." The hunt was no longer about revenge. It was about an obsession. As Zora led Maya into the rainy streets, hiding her face under a low-brimmed cap, she felt the eyes of the city on her. The shadows of Seoul were no longer a hiding place. They were a trap. The Waitress was gone, and the Black Lotus was being hunted by the very monster she had tried to teach a lesson. The The drug-fueled obsession that had consumed Kang-Dae was a signal to his rivals that the dragon was wounded. In the cold world of the Black Dragon Syndicate, blood in the water only meant one thing: a shark was about to be eaten. Director Lim, Kang-Dae's most ambitious underboss, sat in a smoke-filled backroom of a traditional tea house, showing the viral video to the Syndicate's Council of Elders. "He was humiliated by a waitress," Lim hissed, his eyes glinting with a sharp, predatory greed. "He is addicted, erratic, and he has brought shame to our name. The dragon is no longer fit to lead." The elders nodded slowly. They didn't care about Kang-Dae's childhood trauma or the ghosts he chased. They cared about the bottom line. By the time the moon reached its zenith, the order had been signed. Kang-Dae was to be removed, permanently. Back at the penthouse, Kang-Dae was spiraling. The withdrawal symptoms were starting to claw at his nerves, and the white powder was no longer enough to numb the realization that his empire was a house of cards. When the heavy mahogany doors of his suite were kicked open, it wasn't the police. It was his own men, men he had raised, men he had paid, men who now looked at him with the cold eyes of executioners. "Lim sends his regards, boss," Minho said, stepping forward with a silenced pistol. The betrayal was absolute. The man who had been Kang-Dae's shadow for a decade was now the one holding the gun. Kang-Dae laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "I spent my life making you monsters. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised when you decide to bite." A firefight erupted as Kang-Dae's few remaining loyalists tried to stand their ground. The penthouse, once a symbol of his absolute power, became a glass-shattered tomb. Kang-Dae managed to stumble toward the private elevator, a bullet wound in his shoulder burning like a brand. He collapsed into the gold-mirrored car, hitting the button for the service basement. As the elevator descended, he realized the bitter irony. He was fleeing the world he had built. He was a king without a crown, a monster without a pack. When the doors opened into the cold, rain-slicked alleyway behind the estate, he fell into the trash. The dragon of soul finally reduced to the filth he had always feared he was. But through the haze of blood and narcotics, he saw a pair of boots, worn, practical, and familiar. He looked up, and for the first time in his life, he felt a genuine flicker of hope. Zora Vance stood over him, not with a shard of glass, but with a look of profound, weary pity. The alleyway was a canyon of wet brick and the stench of iron. Zora had been heading to a black market medical contact to secure Maya's supplies when the sound of suppressed gunfire had echoed from the heights of the Kang estate. She had intended to run, to put as many miles between her and the syndicate as possible, but the sight of the man collapsed against the dumpsters stopped her heart. Kang-Dae looked pathetic. The dragon was shivering, his expensive suit soaked in sewage and blood, his eyes unfocused as the dual agony of a bullet wound and drug withdrawal began to take hold. He looked exactly like the man Zora had almost killed in the ring years ago, a human being stripped of all pretenses. "Help, please," he wheezed, his fingers clawing at the wet asphalt. Zora's training screamed at her to walk away. "He is a monster," her mind whispered. "He tried to destroy you." But as she looked at him, she saw the hungry ghost her Sifu had warned her about. If she left him here to die, she was letting the violence win. She was letting the cycle of blood continue. With a groan of frustration, Zora moved. She didn't use her hands to strike, she used them to lift. She hoisted the heavy, semi-conscious man onto her shoulders, using a specialized carry that distributed his weight across her powerful core. She knew the syndicate would be scouring the streets within minutes. She couldn't go back to her apartment, and she couldn't go to a hospital. She took him to the only place she knew where the world didn't look, an abandoned subway substation deep beneath the city, a place she had scouted during her days as a janitor. For the next 6 hours, Zora became a different kind of warrior. She used her emergency medical kit to extract the bullet, her steady kung fu hands never shaking as she sutured the wound with fishing line. But the physical wound was the easy part. As the drugs began to leave Kang-Dae's system, the real battle began. He started to scream, his body convulsing as his brain demanded the chemicals he had fed it for years. Zora sat across from him, her legs crossed in a meditative lotus position. She didn't touch him, and she didn't comfort him. She simply breathed deep, rhythmic breaths that filled the small, concrete room. "Look at me, Kang-Dae," she commanded, her voice a calm anchor in his storm of pain. "Don't fight the pain. If you fight it, it breaks you. Ride it, like a wave. Find the center of the scream." For the first time in his life, Kang-Dae wasn't being told to be a monster or a king. He was being told to be still. And in the flickering light of a single battery-powered lantern, the Mafia boss began to crawl toward the light Zora carried. The subway substation was a tomb of cold concrete and dripping pipes, but for Kang-Dae, it was a purgatory where time had ceased to exist. For 3 days, he didn't know his own name. He only knew the fire in his veins and the ice in his bones. He thrashed against the thin mattress Zora had laid out, his fingers bleeding as he clawed at the floor, begging for a hit, a pill, anything to stop the feeling of insects crawling beneath his skin. Zora remained an unmoving sentinel. She didn't give him the chemicals he craved. Instead, she gave him small sips of water and forced him into rudimentary physical stances when he had the strength to stand. "The body is a temple, Kang-Dae," she said, her voice cutting through his delirium. "But yours is filled with rot. You have to burn it out before you can build anything new." She stood him up against the damp wall, forcing his legs into a horse stance, a grueling, wide-legged squat that required absolute focus. "Stay. If you fall, the pain wins. If you hold it, you win." Kang-Dae's legs shook violently. Sweat poured down his face, stinging the wound on his neck. Every second was an eternity of agony. He wanted to curse her, to strike her, but every time he looked at her, he saw a level of discipline that made his previous life look like a chaotic joke. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a master of herself. For the first time, the dragon felt the spark of something he hadn't felt since before he held that gun at 10 years old, the desire to be worthy. By the 4th day, the screaming in his head had faded to a dull roar. The tremors had subsided into a steady, hollow ache. He sat on the floor, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken, but for the first time in years, those eyes were clear. He looked at Zora, who was reheating a bowl of simple rice over a portable stove. "Why?" he rasped, his voice a dry husk. "I tried to destroy you. I am the reason you have to hide. Why save a monster like me?" Zora didn't look up from the stove. "Because the world has enough monsters, Kang-Dae, but it's short on men who are brave enough to change. I didn't save the boss. I'm trying to see if there's a human left under all that gold and blood." Kang-Dae looked at his hands, the hands that had ordered deaths and crushed lives. They were trembling, but not from the drugs. They were trembling from the weight of a conscience that was finally waking up. He realized then that Zora hadn't just saved his life, she had given him a mirror. And for the first time, he didn't want to break it. When Kang-Dae finally stepped out of the subterranean shadows, the soul sun was so bright it felt like an accusation. He was 40 pounds lighter, his tailored suit hung off his frame like a shroud, and his hands were steady for the first time in a decade. Zora stood beside him, her presence a silent, mahogany pillar of strength. She had led him to the surface, but the next steps were his to take alone. "The money won't fix what you did," Zora said, watching him look toward the shimmering glass of the Gangnam district. "But it can stop the bleeding for others." Kang-Dae didn't return to the penthouse or the syndicate. Instead, he surfaced at the Seoul Metropolitan Hospital, the very place where Zora's sister, Maya, was scheduled for her final, desperate treatment. He didn't arrive with a motorcade. He arrived in a taxi. He walked into the administrator's office and signed over a blind trust, one that didn't just cover Maya's surgery, but funded a new wing for pediatric dialysis. It was the billionaire's rehab, the process of liquidating a blood-soaked empire to build something that breathed life. Following the donation, Kang-Dae did the unthinkable. He walked into the central police station. He sat in a cold interrogation room and laid out a digital map of the Black Dragon Syndicate's offshore accounts, their drug routes, and the evidence needed to bury Director Lim and the Council of Elders forever. He wasn't snitching to save his skin. He was dismantling the cage he had helped build. "You'll go to prison," the lead investigator said, stunned by the wealth of evidence. "I've been in a prison my whole life," Kang-Dae replied, his voice calm and resonant. "This is just a change of address." Because of his total cooperation and his status as a target of a coup, his lawyers secured a deal. 2 years in a high-security, private rehabilitation and correctional facility, followed by 5 years of probation. During those 2 years, the dragon was scrubbed clean. He spent his days in the facility's garden, practicing the breathing exercises Zora had taught him. He refused the luxury perks his remaining legal funds could buy. He wanted the dirt, the work, and the penance. He was no longer feeding the hungry ghost. He was starving it to death, waiting for the day he could stand before the Black Lotus not as a monster, but as a man who had earned his own shadow. The mountain air near the outskirts of Seoul was crisp, smelling of wet earth and the thousands of blossoms that filled the valley. Amani, now living as Zora once more, moved through the rows of her small flower shop, her hands covered in soil rather than blood. She had used the peace of the last 2 years to heal. Maya was healthy, living a full life in the city, and the Black Lotus had finally found her sanctuary in the scent of jasmine and lilies. The chime above the door rang, a sound that usually meant a local villager was looking for a bouquet. But the footsteps that followed were heavy, measured, and carried a rhythmic grace that Zora recognized instantly. She didn't look up from the roses she was pruning. "The soil is better for the soul than the silk, isn't it?" the voice said. It was deep, resonant, and entirely sober. Zora turned. Kang-Dae stood at the entrance. The gaunt, twitching ghost of the penthouse was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had been carved from the mountain itself. He wore a simple linen shirt and dark trousers. The gold watches and obsidian rings had been replaced by a quiet, steady gaze. He looked healthy, his skin clear. His presence no longer a vacuum, but a calm, grounding force. "You look well, Kang-Dae," Zora said, her voice steady. "I am whole," he replied. He walked toward her, stopping exactly 3 paces away, the distance of respect. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple wooden box. He didn't open it. He simply held it in his palm, looking at her with a vulnerability that was more powerful than any weapon he had ever carried. "I spent 2 years learning to breathe. I spent every day of those 2 years thinking about the woman who taught me how. I have liquidated the last of the Kang assets. It's all in a foundation for orphans now. I have nothing left but a name that I've tried to clean." He slowly lowered himself to one knee. This wasn't the forced humiliation of the VIP lounge. This was the voluntary surrender of a king who had found a higher power. He opened the box to reveal a ring, not a diamond, but a single, perfectly carved piece of black jade in the shape of a lotus. "Zora Vance," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to be a boss. I don't want to be a dragon. I just want to be the man who walks beside you. Will you marry me?" The silence in the flower shop was deafening. Zora looked at the ring, then at the man who had traveled through hell to find his heart. The moment of shock for the world was over. Now, there was only the truth between 2 survivors. The sun began to dip behind the peaks of the Gyeonggi Mountains, casting long, golden fingers of light across the flower shop. The scent of the lilies seemed to intensify in the cooling air. Zora looked down at Kang-Dae, still kneeling on the wooden floor, his head bowed in a gesture of absolute devotion. This was the man who once thought the world was beneath his feet, now offering his life to a woman he once tried to break. Zora reached out, her calloused fingers gently tilting his chin up so he had to meet her gaze. Her eyes were soft, filled with a deep, aching affection, but they were also as unyielding as the mountains. "Kang-Dae," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm. "Look at what you've done. You've climbed out of the abyss. You've turned blood into life. You are a good man now, and I love the man you've become." She slowly closed the wooden box in his hand, pushing it gently back toward his chest. "But I cannot marry you." Kang-Dae didn't flinch. He didn't erupt in the rage of his past. He simply swallowed, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "Why, Zora? Is the shadow of who I was still too dark?" "No," Zora said, stepping back to let the light fall between them. "I love you, but I spent my whole life being defined by others. First as a weapon for my sifu, then as a target for your world, and then as a savior for your soul. If I marry you, I become the wife of the reformed boss. I become a part of a story that still tastes of gold and blood." She walked to the door and opened it, letting the evening breeze swirl the flower petals around them. You need to learn how to be a man on your own, without a lotus to hold you up. And I need to see who Zora is when she isn't fighting for someone else's life. Kang-Dae stood up, his stature tall but his spirit humble. He understood. For the first time, he realized that true love wasn't about the happily ever after of a contract. It was about respecting the freedom of the person who saved you. "Then I will be your neighbor," he said with a small, sad smile. "I will live in the valley, I will work the land, and I will buy my flowers from you every morning. And perhaps in another lifetime or 10 years from now, we will just be two people meeting for the first time." He bowed low, a deep, traditional bow of respect, and walked out into the twilight. Zora watched him go, her heart heavy but her spirit light. She hadn't just saved a life, she had broken a cycle. As she closed the shop for the night, she realized she was finally truly free. The waitress was gone, the champion was at rest, and the woman was finally, peacefully home.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets you know when new videos drop. Lastly, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video.